Chapter 25.
The Rise of the American City, Part 2. Introduction. In this lecture, we continue our exploration of the American city in the rising industrial era, and as you must have noticed by now, you are hearing about a lot of subjects that, to you, may not seem to have a direct connection to the history of American cities, but in fact they do, because, as I mentioned at the outset, the city in American history became a microcosm of modernity, a laboratory where social, political, and economic experiments were tried first. So, whatever we are talking about, if it is in the nature of an experiment, trust me, we are talking about life in the city at this time. That includes the suburbs of the cities, too, by the way, the satellite towns which were connected to the city by streetcars and local railroads. That said, we pick up the thread here from the previous lecture, talking about education, and we finish that discussion with some facts about the growth of private colleges in this period, again, most of them established within or nearby major cities. I mentioned earlier that robber baron Cornelius Vanderbilt endowed a university which bears his name, and Andrew Carnegie paid for hundreds of Carnegie libraries to carry forward his reputation as a beneficent philanthropist. They weren't the only ones. In this lecture, you will learn about many other robber baron philanthropists, too. Keep in mind that they offered their millions for charity before the income tax was created in 1913, so they didn't have the write-off advantages of that new law. Educational institutions were popular recipients of robber baron largesse, but in the long run, vocational training schools and technical schools, which got along without their money, turned out to be even more important in preparing people for careers in the new industrial age. But American universities still made room for a sizable contingent of deep thinkers and philosophical speculators, and their intellectual journeys were uniquely American in tenor and in the subjects they chose to explore. In fact, they established and they embellished a new school of philosophy, the pragmatists. A list of these daring thought experimenters is provided in this lecture, and samples of their logic and their thinking. You could linger for the duration of an entire academic career in the fragrant intellectual meadow of any of these avant-garde explorers of the sublime and the possible, just trying out their logic to see how well it comports with your experience. I hope you at least look in on them for coffee, so to speak. Their works were written as an invitation to your curiosity, and their approachability is one of the wonderfully American features of their thought. Even when they are being absurd, they are entertaining, as if to say that it's all in good fun. You might be surprised, as many students are, at how relevant the philosophical ramblings of the American pragmatic philosophers, as they came to be called, eventually became. Oliver Wendell Holmes, for instance, who sat on the U.S. Supreme Court from 1902 to 1932, significantly changed how his colleagues interpreted the meaning of the law, because his emphasis was on what the actual effects of the law would be, not on how closely it conformed to legal precedent, which had been the standard up till then. You will hear all about that in this lecture, and about many other effects that the pragmatic philosophers had on other issues of their day as well. But Holmes' active and interventionist curiosity about the practical uses of the law was just a reflection of a deeper, expanding curiosity in the reading public at large, which was spreading during those years like the ripples from a rock thrown in the middle of a pond, again mostly in the cities, since that's where the knowledge, the thinkers, the social whirl, the universities, and the libraries were. In a time before radio, television, or the Internet, people got their information by reading and conversation. The next part of this lecture, then, takes you accordingly into the expanding world of the public library, including Carnegie's libraries, which for many people at the turn of the century were the only libraries in town. Following that, you'll get a description of the rather miraculous invention and perfection of the linotype printing press in 1884, which actually made mass printing possible for the first time. You will learn how the machine works. It was scarcely less important in the information-hungry industrial era of the modern American city than Johannes Gutenberg's invention of movable type in 1439. The linotype printing press was so fast that it was not improved for 90 years. Even then, it was only replaced by a computerized machine that worked on the same principle. You'll get the whole story here. The important thing is that for the first time, starting about 1885, the printing press could print news faster than news could actually happen, or that reporters could report it. That led to printing anything that would fill up the page, and that led to a new school of journalism, which has defined what news is and what journalism is ever since. That doesn't mean, by the way, that the reading public had to settle for gossip and slander sheets passed off as news. In fact, it meant the opposite. A lot of talented and important American writers could afford to get their works published for the first time after 1885 because their publishers had a linotype printing press. Two books in particular, published by otherwise obscure authors just as the linotype printing press exploded on the scene in the publishing world, have had such a singular effect on American history, especially in the cities, that they have never been out of print in over 120 years. You'll learn all about these two amazing literary masterpieces in this lecture. Plus, you'll get a biography of their authors. The linotype printing press, combined with the plethora of libraries, the concentrations of people in the burgeoning cities, the expansion of literacy and public schools, also mostly in the cities, created a new, insatiable market for written material of all types. Remember, people didn't yet have radio to listen to, television to watch, or movies to go to. The known world was what you read, what you heard, what you saw personally. So, if you weren't talking or listening to somebody, you had your face in a book, if you knew how to read, and almost everybody learned how to read in those days, including most immigrants, who made learning to read English a priority, out of necessity. The publishing world responded to this new and growing demand for reading matter accordingly, and turned out tons of literature, snapshots of American culture, taken in a moment of time. In this lecture, you will learn about two controversial writers whose works were at this time at the top of everybody's must-read list, both of them household names in their day, both of whom shook the country's cultural foundations to its core, especially in the cities, where they had the most impact. You will find these literary adventurers and cultural antagonists hugely entertaining, though they were deadly serious at the time, about their perceived mandates to shake things up. You will probably love one of them and hate the other, as people did then. But which one becomes your hero depends on your own preconceived ideas about the legitimacy of their contrasting points of view. This leads us, appropriately, to the various reform movements of that day. Again, almost all of them fermenting in the cities. Many of these movements were energized by women, which led to the creation of the Women's Club movement. Women's clubs appeared for every conceivable purpose. Women were beginning, by the turn of the century, to feel, and certainly to want, and soon to demand, more empowerment, more equality with men, and more opportunity in general. Women's clubs became a base for other reform movements energized by women, like the women's suffrage movement, to give women the vote, the prohibition movement, to outlaw the manufacture, sale, and consumption of alcoholic beverages, and the Women's Christian Temperance Union, to militate for the application of Christian principles in solving a variety of societal problems. We close this lecture with an account of two astonishing and thoroughly American developments in the city at this time. The first one was the appearance of the Hudson River School of Landscape Painting, which captured the soul and spirit of the American wilderness, and the second was the establishment of a unique school of city planning called the City Beautiful movement. I alluded to it in the previous lecture. The Hudson River School of Landscape Painting was based on a kind of religious interpretation of the meaning of the land, particularly of the unspoiled wilderness. Artists would hike for miles and days to see for just a few minutes a scene they tried to quickly render onto canvas before the ethereal light which bathed the hushed cathedral of mountains and waterfalls faded into the quiet purple mist of dusk. Often all they had time for was a sketch. So, with discipline born of an almost messianic passion to put the whole shrine of nature on canvas, they would hold in their mind's eye the memory of the fleeting scene as they bumped and stumbled back to civilization, then paint in the studio what they still saw in their heads, and probably in their dreams by that time. One wonders if having a modern camera would have actually helped them, because the finished pictures always surpass in majesty the real view. So by letting the picture unfold in his imagination, the artist of the Hudson River School was able to add to it that extra dimension of his fancied reality, which was actually what he felt about the scene, as much as what he saw in the scene. All of these artists had their studios in the city, and viewers would pay $2, a lot of money then, and line up around the block to spend 30 seconds in front of the finished paintings. It was part of the city experience, and you will learn much more about it in this lecture. The other city experience nobody wanted to miss was the city itself, usually the downtown core, especially the part that the planners and builders of the City Beautiful movement were responsible for, and within the city, the buildings that architects Lewis Henry Sullivan and Henry Hobson Richardson had so brilliantly designed. Sullivan was the first architect to figure out how to assemble a steel skeleton for a large building so that it would be strong enough to support the hundreds of tons of floors, walls, ceilings, elevator shafts, and other appurtenances that were needed to complete the design. Once he figured that out, there was no limit to how high a building could be built, so he is very appropriately honored as the father of the modern skyscraper. Sullivan built big if he built at all. His colleague, though, Henry Richardson, built small, and seldom used any steel in his buildings. His favorite projects were churches, train stops, and libraries. No two designs were the same. Each was a kind of jewel box of architectural surprises. You will learn the particulars of each school of architecture in this lecture, and enjoy biographies of both Sullivan and Richardson. And finally, at the end of this lecture on the history and contributions of the American city in the early industrial age, we must take a bow in the direction of the new discipline of landscape architecture as well, particularly the work of Frederick Law Olmsted, whose work is as timeless as it is ubiquitous, because, far from being dated, like buildings become, however cleverly constructed, landscapes only become more beautiful and more magical with age as the trees and bushes grow and fill out the sylvan scene, and the walking paths and garden vistas acquire a soft patina of Edenic innocence. This is the effect that Olmsted's landscapes have on people today, 100 years after he sculpted and planted them in dozens of towns and cities, on college campuses, in green belts, around lakes, and in the heart of downtown, like Central Park in New York, his best-known creation. In this lecture you get a thorough review of all of these unique and superlative achievements of the American city in this time period, the buildings of Sullivan and Richardson, the landscapes of Olmsted, the genesis and history of the City Beautiful movement. Your biggest challenge is to get through it all. There is so much to learn about it. I hope you keep coming back to the American city in this time period when it was first coming of age and embodied an exhilarating feeling of promise, prosperity, and possibility for everybody who lived there.